I'm happy to do that.
But legally, we would have to ask people.
Okay, then shall I stop that now? Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan and Karen and Sean there. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. This paper, according to words to text, should be about 35 to 40 minutes. If I start getting to about that time and I'm still not quite finished, I might just stop so we can get on to some conversation. And I'll sort of explain why. I mean, one reason for that is it's an unfinished paper. It's something in progress, which I'll be submitting for publication for a book in January. And the paper still hasn't found its form yet. It's one of those that has been sort of in a shoebox for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And I'm trying to finish it up now. Trying to finish has been tricky because it started as a conversational response through emails with a fellow Coleridge scholar, Seamus Perry. And I got a little bit exasperated with part of his response, which is a good and normal thing, I think, in academic conversation. But he told me he finds Coleridge most unconvincing when he focuses on a Platonic or a Neoplatonic or Plotinian sense of ideas as an underlying metaphysical reality. And why did Perry say that? He said because elsewhere in Coleridge's writing, in his notebooks and his poetry, elsewhere, the substance of nature is too dear to him. And I think his thrust was that he can't really take a lot of the metaphysics seriously when it gets so rarefied, because the squidgy, oozy, oily, stuff and substance of nature is a very dear thing. So he can't take the rest of it seriously. And that just exasperates me, as if, one of my responses is, well, please read the whole thing, the whole, 58-volume corpus again, because it sounds like you've missed something. I tend to be exasperated by this kind of division imposed on Coleridge's thinking, because sidelining his metaphysics removes the ability to see that appreciation of the substance of nature as an outpouring or a blossoming of a view that holds, in Coleridge's mind, a universal cosmic sense of energy to be central to being an experience. And besides that divisionist point of view, other writers, for example, the new materialist writers, have also tried to separate what they see as the naturalist value in Coleridge's prose, or some of his prose, and more of his poetry, separate that from the Romantic ideology and its idealist metaphysics. Obviously, I'm thinking of Jerome McGann's, iconoclastic work and very influential Romantic ideology, but also people like Marjorie Levinson, who have written on Coleridge in this vein. But I find this approach dismisses not only his work on how the freedom of the will, because many of these writers end up in favor of a kind of mechanism, a kind of modern determinism, and certainly a materialism. And this dismisses not only his work on the freedom of the will and how it can take advantage of the lower level mechanisms of psychological association without fully submitting to it, but it also fails to acknowledge how Coleridge's view, following philosophers like Leibniz and Kant and them especially, his view of how matter as a temporary, in his words, matter is a temporary pause or a momentary or temporary rather coagulation of opposed energies, and how this view is much more aligned with contemporary, 20th and 21st century physics and quantum theory than the 18th and 19th century models of materialism, which really do start to look old when read against, accounts of quantum physics, for example. Yet for the last few decades, the material turn in literary studies has championed what I think they see as a sensuous and substantial view of nature, fighting boldly against the generic idealism that looks down on the embodied in favor of the rational, abstract, and intellectual. But, you know, I want to argue that that's missing the point too, and that's an incorrect pastiche. The view is outdated. One reason for that is that such a notion of materialism has been obsolete in philosophy since at least the 1950s, when materialism was more or less turned away in favor of what they call physicalism, which in short is basically saying, you know, materialism used to say that we believe that everything is fundamentally matter, and there's a definition for that, which is usually atomic. But now, they were saying in the 1950s and on, now we're just saying we're physicalists in that we believe that in the future, physicists, you know, everything will ultimately be explicable by physics, whatever that solution happens to be. It's much less of a materialistic commitment, you see. And it leaves a lot more room open for energic explanations and understandings. So in this essay, I intend to take a broader view, taking as my subject what Coleridge called his ideal realism. In his nature writing, especially in his notebooks, Coleridge tracked nature and its experiential effects, and he did that for his own delights, but also in the belief that intense observation and careful articulation of natural phenomena and their recurring patterns could reveal insights into the productivity of the natural world. This wonderful image of an embodying relation where universal laws of nature incessantly materialize, crumble, and resurrect is given in his observation of what he calls a white eddy rose formed by water frothing around a boulder in the middle of the River Tees at Barnard Castle, blossoming, breaking, and reforming in quick recurrence. It is, he wrote in his notebook, the life that we live. For Coleridge, an absorbed state of attention to nature was needed for both poetic creation and philosophical insight into the universe, aided by observation, imagination, and speculation. This interrelating of the objective and the subjective is what also drew Coleridge to Friedrich Schelling's identity philosophy, which basically said that the mind is the inside of nature and that nature is the inside of mind, and on which Coleridge relied on famously for his Biographia Literaria in 1816. And in fact, he plagiarized for a span of about 8 pages. Here and there, he's plagiarizing Schelling. By August 1818, however, you know, a couple of years later, Coleridge had abandoned the treatment of the physical and ideal as equal opposites. This marks the time when Coleridge is increasingly distancing his thinking from Schelling. And this is why I encourage romanticists to read and teach the prose Coleridge beyond the Biographia Literaria, which is basically the staple. But in a way, Coleridge hadn't quite found his philosophical feet then. I'm saying, you know, start reading more from a couple of years later, when he himself realized that he'd been, in his words, taken in by Schelling. However, to be fair to Schelling, Schelling himself had actually abandoned this same identity philosophy, which Coleridge couldn't have any truck with anymore. But by 1818, Schelling himself had abandoned it, finding it overtaken with his philosophy of nature and completely overtaken by his essay on freedom. So Coleridge developed a metaphysical view that he called ideal realism. And in there, physical forces, matter, and phenomena arise and evolve from universal powers that he held to be ultimately ideal. By this word ideal, he referred not to ideas in any Humean sense, you know, subjective impressions, but to powers conceived as eternal verities, eternal truths, and living ideas. And these included for him the law of polarity, which he outlines in his 1818 Rifacimento edition of The Friend. And in this law of polarity, he describes universal powers become manifest. They cannot ordinarily become manifest. In themselves, they cannot become manifest. But in the way that we can have any cognizance of them, they become manifest as opposed forces. That's the only way that they can become known to us. His examples include what was popular at the time, positive and negative poles of magnetism or charges of electricity, as well as the dispersal, the sort of infinite dispersal of light, outwards versus the force of gravitation. And he saw also the evolution of society and history as arising also through the interplay of opposed forces, so that cultures and laws and civilization evolve by ever progressively realized free human beings, which act as proponents of ideas, as the correlate forms of powers. That might sound quite Whiggish, but the path, as we know, and as Coleridge knew from history and experience, was not one of linear progress, but a dialectic, and sometimes a violent one, as the pendulum swings between poles that express the idea in opposed ways, because remember, the idea cannot become manifest in itself, as it is in itself, but only through opposed forces. Yeah. Well, same with cultural ideas, as the pendulum swings between poles that express the idea in opposed ways. Syntheses are nonetheless left, as people are struggling to find some wholeness out of these extremes. Syntheses are left in artifacts, in works of culture, in the law books, and so on. And it's these, as it were, synthetic artifacts, the remnants of the big swings between the opposed forces, which advance society. Okay, so I'll examine Coleridge's ideal realism to inquire how his sense of the substance of nature, because remember, this paper's in some sense a very late response to another reader of Coleridge who just couldn't have any truck with the ideal Coleridge, with the metaphysical Coleridge. Because why, I asked? Because the substance of nature is so dear to him. So I'll examine how this ideal realism goes into his sense of the substance of nature as something living, and it thrives in his ideal realist metaphysics as much as it does in his poetry and nature writing. Understanding how this is achieved requires closer critical distinctions between various perspectives that are too often lumped together as idealism, and that becomes the bugbear, on one side, and realism, the hero, on the other. In particular, Coleridge's ideal realism, a term which he himself used, must be starkly and definitively differentiated from subjective idealism, which is what people often mean when they just use idealism in some kind of lumped together way. In trying to understand his thought, then, one should not pursue any theory to abstraction, so that the very lively sense of what it's like to read him as an author disappears. The substance of nature, as has been said, is too dear to him. However theoretical his own developed thoughts became, he grounded them always in concrete examples and illustrations. For example, his famous image of the water insect, floating with the current here, resisting it there, as an emblem of how imagination must be both active and passive. Such illustrations are not merely given as pedagogic aids, to help other people understand the thoughts that he's arrived at. They actually are his way of arriving at thoughts, thinking through them. And we know this from thousands of notebook entries. At one particularly technical point in his logic, for instance, Coleridge provided concrete images to suggest ways of thinking through the highly abstract processes of geometrical construction, which he calls Plotinian creative contemplation. He's trying to explain how geometers, for example, might make constructions and come at new truths with lines and solids and points, etc. And in one luminous image, he grounds his discussion of this abstract matter in the optical phenomena created by his observations of the rapid flight of tiny insects caught in torchlight. And he compared how their shimmering trails to how the mind creates geometrical points and lines in the imagination. And that both are similar to how boys produce, he says, the circle of light by a piece of kindled charcoal whirled rapidly round. Logic can be deadly boring, but it is not simply that Coleridge was a poet who wandered into the logical laboratory and illuminatingly set it aflame with images of nature. Rather, he consistently attended to the flames of thought and of possibility that give logic its value. Reading Coleridge's philosophical prose, one recognizes the sensuous and intellectual connection with nature found in his poetry and in his meditations on rainbows, river eddies, sunlight changing colors, reflections, scudding clouds, lightning, craggy hills, and more, recorded beautifully in his notebooks. The substance of nature as something living motivated his prose works too, his philosophy as much as his poetry. His sensual come intellectual sense of the substance of nature is a fine introduction to his theory of nature as physis or physis, of physics as coming to be, as the unfolding, ever-changing physical and phenomenal embodiment of universal laws. He understood that ideas require, they need aesthetic expression if our sense, if our understanding, if our imagination is to get any kind of grasp on them. They need to be put into imagery, they need to be felt. Ideas must be felt in order to be grasped. In his view, ideas are eternal powers that can only become manifest dynamically through opposed forces, and then in the concrete, transient, evolving syntheses of material forms. This is quite the opposite thing for simply high-mindedly abandoning the concrete and the aesthetic form. Quite the opposite thing. One can imagine this kind of metaphysical scheme here of how ideas, which can only be understood through through opposite forces, and then in their syntheses, the synthesis, in a sense, is a mirror. If you imagine the idea as some kind of, he called it a prothesis, but it's what comes before the thesis and the antithesis, through which it is possible to come into, as it were, our world or our thought, And you have these opposite, an idea is, in a sense, expressed or manifest through these opposite forces. And then struggling to come to terms with extremes, humans create syntheses with a bit of this and a bit of that, and it's something livable, something tenable. These syntheses, in a sense, are like a mirror image, like a reflection, like, I don't know, the moon or the sun in the river, of the unity of the original prothetic idea, And this is a kind of an image well, it's kind of an image, I call it in the paper, I call it, it's almost you can think of it with a hydraulic or a pneumatic image, just like the eddy rose on the River Tees. As soon as it forms, it shatters, yet it ceaselessly re-emerges in resurrected moments, and its broken continuity is something more vibrant and striking than mere stability. I mean, it transcends stability and collapse by being both. And it holds a fascination. It certainly held a fascination on Coleridge, the writer. With imagery like that, you have not just a philosophy of nature, but a philosophy of life. As he said, this is the life that we live. And it's rooted in an absorption in the substance of nature that would be emaciated, I contend, if removed from its metaphysics of ideas and powers and forces that manifest and become evolved in and through natural phenomena. Here, there's a kind of a deeper underlining for Coleridge, cosmic power that can only be manifest by channeling into opposite forces, I repeat. From their clashes emerge sparks and boulders in that sort of Kubla Khan image, where a mighty fountain was momently forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail. Let's stay with that little bit. Coleridge's philosophy of nature as physis can be construed as a kind of physicalism, perhaps, as, for example, the unmanifest and the noumenal is expressed through the physical and phenomenal, which are real in his system, to become manifest. But this would be a physicalism which does not really bottom out at the physical, the level where powers become manifest as forces, and from out of which material forms and phenomena emerge for him as syntheses of opposed forces. His view might be described as in part physicalist, with a qualification, and yet it remains thoroughly opposed to materialism. Not that it opposes matter, it doesn't. Matter is included in that metaphysical view. Rather, it opposes the idea, which is debunked now anyway, that fundamentally everything is at bottom matter. It does not, however, oppose materialism in the way that false pastiches of Coleridge's idealism would have it, because they conflate philosophical idealisms into subjective idealisms too often. which is the theory that matter is unreal because it is merely a series of impressions in the human or divine mind, as Bishop Berkeley would have it, without having any external reality. Yet, to repeat, for Coleridge, matter is real and external. It's just that it's not fundamental. Preceding matter for him are forces, and preceding forces are the energies that are the expressions of powers, which for him are the activities of what he called, in a Platonic sense, ideas. So his philosophy is an ideal realism because it asserts the reality of ideas beyond the human mind. It's an ideal realism because it says ideas are real. That's the first sense of that phrase. It is also a realism because it asserts the reality of material existence. It doesn't say that material things are simply impressions, like the extreme empiricists. Don't forget that Berkeley was an extreme empiricist. It doesn't say that they are simply existing either in our own minds or in God's. It's also a realism because it asserts, Coleridge's, because it asserts the reality beyond the human mind of values. And in that, he's partly allied with Immanuel Kant. Values conceived as universal truths, but practical truths. Ethical, we would say nowadays, practical truths that any rational being would intuit, or if not that, would know as self-evident to any rational thinking being, wherever they might be in the universe. All of these asserted realities in ideal realism depend on an underlying reality of ideas and powers. And in that, he agrees with Plato, except that for Coleridge, he further rooted this logos or realm of ideas in for him, the divine will. Although that's not necessary in every kind of ideal realism. I might get to Iris Murdoch, who later had an atheistic version of something quite similar. So he's a far cry from material monism. Matter for him is created from powers, and in that he's opposed to Democritus and Epicurus, whose reductionisms were scientifically renewed by Galileo and Pierre Gassendi, both of whom saw matter as basic rather than as something that emerges from powers or energies. He also set himself the divisionist materialism of Cartesian dualism, which cordoned off the mental in order that science can get back to work, in a sense. And conveniently, that would keep the church happy, something that Galileo might have thought of earlier. And so the Cartesian dualism sort of cordoned off the mental so that the scientists could focus on the quantifiable world of matter, which, however, Coleridge remarked, Descartes propounded as a truth of fact, the doctrine of the universe as a lifeless machine whirled about by the dust of its own grinding. So this idea of the substance of nature as being something too dear to him, for some people to seriously consider his metaphysics, well, actually, it's that dearness of the substance of nature as something alive, as something involving universal ideas, as something involving some sort of promise of a truth of ethical values that we held dear, as he hoped Kant had proven. It's this which actually so much involved his metaphysics, as opposed to an opposed metaphysics of somebody of a basically materialist metaphysics of somebody like Descartes, which left him with very little hope for humanity and value. So much for philosophers and scientists there. Among the literary forebears who he greatly admired, we can think of John Milton, who, of course, he basically admired him enormously, apart from his theology, especially in that Milton holding God to be some kind of concrete material being, creating the whole universe out of his own material stuff. For good reason, it's William Blake's metaphysics which is much nearer to Coleridge. Milton followed a tradition of materialism that followed the logic of quantity and extension established by Francis Bacon, Galileo, and Descartes. The logic of quantity and extension. The growing cultural dominance of this Galilean logic of quantity and extension, of exteriority, forced underground the development of a corresponding logic of quality and intention, that is, of interiority. By intention, that's with an S, not with a T. Intentionality with an S here, referring to a radically internal structure, not a structure like the inside of an external form, because the inside of anything is just another outside once you strip it down to there. Not that kind, but radical in the sense that it's a logical structure. It's never an exteriority or an outside, the logical structure of a form or essence. And there's a sort of branch of the history of ideas which kind of got snipped off, which kind of got lopped there with the dominance of the Galilean logic. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, necessarily, but the strong development of this logic of quantity and extension. But it might be a bad thing that the logic of quality and intention was so drastically submerged. So this logic of intentionality, of interiority, of quality, can refer to the internal content of a concept, and that's just basically a dictionary definition. And it can also refer to the underlying basis, or what the physicist David Bohm called the implicate order in his cosmology, from out of which all exteriority unfolds. The logic of intention, with an S, was continued through the Cambridge Platonists, for example, in Rafe Cudworth's theory of a universal shaping or plastic principle. But the logic of qualities battled far more against the stream, even than that. One of its most thoroughgoing, influential, yet poorly acknowledged proponents was the mystic Jacob Boehme, who envisioned 7 spirits or energies that make up the world and our experiential life. He saw, in a sense, a kind of an initial Big Bang moment, but not one that led fairly soon to a material world rapidly arising, one that for a very long time was nothing but energies and qualities producing their own opposites, and then complicating that by a series of theses and antitheses and syntheses and chiasmic goings on that produced a whole complicated world of qualities. And only then something like the bodies came into being. This is one that basically inverted the Galilean order. Not that Boehme was deliberately doing that. This German mystic was deliberately doing that. But it just so happened he was versed in things like alchemy and astronomy, and for that he's not really been studied with great seriousness, and yet he's had an enormous influence on Schelling, on Hegel, on William Blake, on Coleridge. Boehme's writings are, as I said, very obscure. Blake, who was massively influenced by him, was a wholehearted Boehmenist, much more so than Coleridge. And a study of Boehme is indispensable to illuminating the shadowy contours of the Blakean worldview. But in this sort of more or less Boehmenist way, nature for Coleridge is at once something real and ideal as a power. And it's unfortunate that crude distinctions between realism and idealism have confused Coleridge or led to oversimplified readings of his ideal realism in relation to the substance of nature. The poverty of understanding what the word idea can mean to different things and how ideal corresponds as an adjective to those various conceptions is difficult. It should be noted that in discussing Coleridge, the words ideas and idealism are not to be understood, as I said, in terms of subjective idealism or in any Lockean sense. One philosopher, Samuel Rickless, abuses the term idealism when he says that, and I'm quoting, "Idealism is the view that sensible objects like tables and chairs and their sensible properties such as shape and color are nothing more than mind-dependent entities." And this is coming from a philosopher who's an expert in Berkeley. Rickless has here, in fact, define subjective idealism, not idealism at all, you know, or not idealism in toto. That's impossible with such a short definition. And you'll find contradictory variants of idealism that absolutely cannot be covered by such a definition. They're not using this term, ideal realism, Coleridge's term. Iris Murdoch has pressed this sort of ideal realism further by adhering to an atheistic kind of Platonism without any divine mind to conceive them. For her, the idea of the good is what Plato said it was. It was, you know, the ultimate reality, beyond being and dignity and power. In Coleridge's ideal realism, the reality of ideas as universal principles is independent of and partly realizable by the human mind. And they inform the human mind, which in turn can contemplate those ideas. Ideas also have, he held, a correlative aspect as laws of nature, whose essence is in part not to be perceived. The things that science studies are phenomena, but the laws of nature themselves are essentially non-phenomenal. That's one of the points there. Coleridge himself complained of the opposition between, you know, by certain writers, between the real and the ideal. He said, I avoid the false opposition of real and ideal. Idea with me is contradistinguished only from conception, notion, construction, impression, sensation. At the end of a notebook entry describing how for Aristotle, the ideal or forming unity constitutes the unity of actual formed shape, Coleridge emphasizes that of the ideal unity, it is well, but let it be remembered that it is at the same time actual and constitutive, and that therefore the term ideal must be opposed not to the real, but to the phenomenal. I think I'm going to skip a little bit to move on there. Skipping another example of the misuse of the term idealism. Unfortunately, I'll skip over pages 10 and 11, which use a section from the poem The Aeolian Harp, where he defends a Plotinian conception of the one life within us and abroad. To move on to the final part now on sort of page 12. So the substance for Coleridge of living nature as intimate as the one life within us. This substance of living nature is intimate. It's the one life within us. Yet is also not just intimate within us, but also grandly pervasive. It's the one life within us and abroad. Abroad on a cosmos suffusing scale, it was for Coleridge. And that is what is so dear to Coleridge. And it suffuses his experience and concept of nature. Here he found deep correspondences between the intentional or radically interior idea and the extension of outer nature. So I'll end with an experience that you probably know. In April 1805, one night in Valletta, where he was acting public secretary to the British governor of Malta for a time during the Napoleonic Wars. He described looking through the window of his office at the moonlight scene outside, and here inner and outer were intuited as somehow blended into symbols of one another. I'll quote his recollection of that. In looking at objects of nature, while I am thinking, as at yonder moon, dim glimmering through the dewy window pane, I seem rather to be seeking, as it were, asking a symbolical language for something within me that already and forever exists, than observing anything new. Even when the latter is the case, yet still I have always an obscure feeling, as if that new phenomenon were the dim awaking of a forgotten or hidden truth of my inner nature. It is still interesting as a word, a symbol. It is logos, the creator and the evolver. This compelling, if excited, experience of the natural vista, of cosmos, and of his self-experience during the experience of the dim, glimmering moon seen through the dewy window pane is an important bridge. It shows an important bridge, bridging outer focused and inner focused attention, inverted as nature within and idea without. Idea without as in abroad, idea at large. The beauty and mystery perceived without as externally existing is profoundly felt in that experience as corresponding to something deep within, the whole of which he identifies with logos, the creator, as communicator. You know, it's word itself, which he's focusing on here, in which inner and outer are sustained and are words for each other. The something within me that Coleridge finds spoken or symbolized in the dim, glimmering moon viewed through the dewy window pane is the presence and influence of the universal ideas within him, in his understanding of it. This sense of the inner life of nature and the universe at large corresponding to a source within us that is far higher and far inward, as he said, is at the heart of the experience of reading Coleridge, I find, and his own sensuous intellectual drive towards the shared reality that he once called that more than man, which is one and the same in all men. The powers and energies of these living laws must first awaken, he thinks, in us before we can see them alive in nature. And it is in this sense that in our life alone does nature live. And in this sense that for Coleridge, the substance of nature is a living power. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That was great. And we've got lots there to think about. I'm sure people will have questions. I have some questions, but I'm going to invite people to thank you for the paper, and then we'll move on to those. So thank you for your paper. With regard to the questions, could people please use the hands up function, and I'll look at the list of participants and pick you out from there. So if anybody has any questions they would like to ask. While people are thinking about that, perhaps I can comment on, you raised the matter of quantum physics, and it sort of makes me aware of how important Coleridge's thinking is actually in the time in which we live now. This is not thinking from over 200 years ago that is out of date. It's immensely relevant and intensely relevant to scientific inquiry that is empirical because it relies on experimentation and observation, but is concerned with concepts and ideas that are really difficult to understand, like force and matter, being in some cases interchangeable and existing at the same point and place in time and in space. I mean, you might like, I can see that Sean's got a question to ask, but whether you want to respond to that, how Coleridge might, how what we know about how Coleridge thought might reflect on the way that particle physics is working in quantum theory now. I have these conversations sometimes with a mathematical friend, and it's really difficult to get your head around the concepts that they're working.
Thanks. Yeah, great. I'm very timid about writing about and talking about this very relation, you know, between quantum physics and older philosophy that's well before the, you know, the quantum era. Very timid because it is so easy to find any mystery and just say, well, that's quantum. And you have, you know, books out like Dana Zohar's The Quantum Mind and so on. And it's just so easy. And I, as somebody who's not at all knowledgeable about these things, you know, I sometimes pick up a book by a good journalist or is it Carlo Rovelli, something like that, and get a little bit of a, you know, just enough so I can maybe write a few sentences, and then I send it to a few people who know more about it than I do. And so I am timid about that. But there are, yes, there's something very intriguing there. The example of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which you mentioned there, was actually I used it as a something that is possibly an analogy, or perhaps more than an analogy, in that when I was trying to explain Coleridge's view of an idea or power which can only become, as it were, known to us, but it's still unknown, but it can only come, as it were, into our world by becoming opposed forces. And then eventually it becomes, in a sense, it regains a kind of unity again through cultural syntheses. And I was thinking of an analogy there with knowing the position, or, but not both, or not and, or knowing the position or the momentum of a particle. But it's absolutely impossible to know both at once. And I thought there's something like an analogy in there. But then my capability of discussing this kind of thing falls apart, and I actually just erased that. Well, actually, I think I deleted that from what I sent to you, but I highlighted it in yellow for me because it is something intriguing that I want to unpack a bit more for the essay. So yes. Sean, was your question related to that or something else? Thank you, Susan. Yeah.
I know I had a different question, and thanks very much for speaking to us, Peter. It was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I had various...
Sorry for being slow and missing out about 5 or 6 pages, but thank you, Sean. Yeah,
that's okay. Yeah, sorry, my internet is unstable, so I might disappear. I had a few questions, but one I suppose that was at the sort of forefront of my mind was, could you possibly say any more about in what sense Coleridge's notion of idea is not theistic? Because it certainly sounded theistic from a lot of what you said, and I'm very conscious that I haven't read the 58 volumes that you referred to, so I'm kind of coming from a position of ignorance about this. But if I understood it correctly, you said that his notion of idea is one that is capable of bringing into existence powers, and that those powers give rise to the mental and the physical, something along those lines. It may be that the word idea has, to me, associations with the notion of mind that I find very hard to get away from, but it certainly sounded theistic. I wonder if you could just say a bit more about that, because I found that very interesting.
Well, it is. I mean, the way that you phrase your question, the answer to it is there isn't one. In what way can this be explained as something that is not a theistic point of view? It is, and the reason why I brought in Iris Murdoch is I don't want to scare away atheists or people who are very strongly committed that they won't smell anywhere near theism, they won't abide being anywhere near that sort of thing. And Iris Murdoch's put together a philosophy which was at once atheistic and idealistic in this sense of ideal realism, although it's not a term that she used. I mean, I identify her philosophy too as an ideal realism, with at least the first sense of ideas that I mentioned. But I think probably with Iris Murdoch, all of them, that first sense of ideal realism that I mentioned being a commitment to the reality of ideas as, and probably for want of a better word, certainly today, than ideas because of all of its connotations, but as universal principles, which for Coleridge are, it's not necessarily that they in a sense give rise to powers, because in a lot of his writings and in a lot of different places, he talked about them as being correlates, and he used that phrase quite a lot and very confidently. Ideas and powers are correlates of each other, and in a sense they're two sides of the same thing. But ultimately, for him, although you don't have to be committed to theism to be attracted to that idea, as I say, by looking at Iris Murdoch, you can see a way of doing that. But ultimately, for him, these are based. Ideas and powers are based in the abysmal, the depthless depth of the divine will, which is below the intellect in a sense, or profounder than the intellect. Why? Because if there's anything already there which can condition the will, then the will is not free. And that's an argument which is derived from Jacob Boehme, a much underappreciated thinker, because it's just a too difficult one, and not necessarily a great writer, who influenced. Schelling had the same idea, and But so Coleridge's idea of freedom basically came from Kant and from Schelling, and this idea of ideas themselves were willed, as it were, into being by the divine will from the abyss, from the unconditioned, almost chaotic abyss of the divine will, is where these ideas come from. So it is theistic, but as I said, you could look at some readings of Plato, including Murdoch's, and including just some straightforward readings of Plato, to find a similar kind of ideal realism that is not theistic. I know Plato himself believed in the gods, but so sometimes some writers have said, well, that's often because he just doesn't want to get into trouble, or he just finds it culturally steady and stable to have a respect for the gods. Things go smoothly when everybody respects the same, pantheon. But yeah, so it doesn't have to be theistic, I think, in order for one to construct an ideal realism.
Okay, thank you. I'll let other people ask questions. Thank you very much.
Just thinking about that before we move on to John Gillies. Peter, that takes me back to Paradise Lost, book 4, and Satan's soliloquy, when the me miserable, which way shall I fly soliloquy, where he blames God because he doesn't have any free will, and then goes about explaining why he does have free will. So anyway, that's for another day, perhaps. But I see that John has his hand raised, and then Karen, and then Adam. So on to you, John, first. John Gillies. John,
can I be heard? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, thanks.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Peter, that was just an incredible paper. I mean, it was just brimming with ideas, energy. It was wonderful, completely wonderful. But I can see why you had it in your bottom drawer for 5 or so years. It's just
still
insanely
nowhere near
difficult.
happy with it. I can see people just not seeing the point of it. Or
okay, with the greatest humility, because I'm not a Coleridgean, as you know. I want to just make two quick points. I mean, one is that I think you might have given Milton a bit of a short shrift here. I mean, Milton, a bit like Coleridge, kept changing his mind, as life went on, as he was opposed, as, he came across kind of new challenges, new facts, if you like. But just have a look at the induction to book 3 in Paradise Lost, where, hail holy light, offspring of heaven firstborn. I mean, here he really says, and he means it, he says, God is light. Never but in unapproached light dwelt from eternity. Then he goes on to, the invocation is all about how, as a blind man, somebody who's been afflicted with blindness, he actually cannot see light. So he's asking you, this idea of God, which is as light, which I find actually very suggestive in terms of modern physics, to enter him and illuminate him. So I would just say, Milton is much more complicated, I think, than
I must admit, in fact, confess that I felt a little guilty because I should have said that the materialist God, or the God of stuff, the God made himself of stuff, of Milton, is actually a spirit stuff.
Sure, yeah, but
not a very, it wasn't some kind of human-shaped thing, or So yeah, I mean, and I should have gone into more detail there.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Second point, because this is.
I will follow up that here with light. Thank you.
But this is a thought I offer with the greatest humility, because it could be completely wrong. But when you were talking about Coleridge there, and perhaps this is part of the difficulty of your project, I kind of felt that there is something so limiting in the language that he's using that yes, he does find it extremely difficult, I think, to do justice to the poetry. Now, if you take some of the images that you're talking about, for example, the image of, what was it called? It was an image of water falling into
the Eddy Rose. The Eddy Rose,
exactly. What that kind of made me think of was the great Impressionists, specifically Monet's water lilies paintings, the really huge ones, in the Orangerie in Paris. And what Monet's doing there, these are massive canvases, and most people just look at them and take selfies in front of them because they haven't got the faintest clue of what he's trying to do. But, you know, in one massive canvas, Monet will focus on the surface of the pond. So it is, as it were, a reflective surface. You see the sky. And then you see other things. In another one, he'll treat the surface as partly kind of translucent, partly transparent, but only partly, and in bits. So you get an incredible kind of interplay of, if you like, kind of impressions. I mean, the Impressionists were called Impressionists as a term of abuse by an art critic in one of Monet's exhibitions, in fact. But, you know, Impressionism is all about trying to kind of capture a reality which is non-substantive, which is kind of dynamic, if you like. And it's all about the interplay of the mind with perceived reality. And here, I just kind of want to offer another thought, another thought. I've been reading recently a book by a man called Francis Ponge. It's about 1923. It's called Parti pris des choses, in other words, on the side of things. And this is about how we perceive things. And he actually takes common things. For example, a mollusk. A mollusk is a favorite object of his. And he tries to describe these things in as kind of phenomenological a fashion as possible. But one of the things that he shows is that phenomenology is impossible in viewing these things because language cuts in almost immediately. And in a really brilliant image, I think, he compares man's relationship to language to that of a mollusk to its shell. So the mollusk, he loves this idea of soft bodies. He goes into this image a number of times, and soft bodies represents the way in which reality, as it were, kind of impinges on our senses. And we don't know quite what it is and what it isn't. But very quickly we reach for, if you like, the freezing power of language to, as it were, freeze it into place. But one of the things that Ponge is saying here is that, you know, perception is all about kind of language at the same time, which is why ideas are so damn important, which is why you keep pushing the envelope of thought in kind of attempting to grasp what it is you perceive. So I guess what I'm saying is that,
if I
to
can,
me, Coleridge
John, can I just intervene there and say, I don't know if you can hear me, sorry. Can I just say that we are running up to 2 o'clock, which is the scheduled end of the seminar, but we're happy to run over on the basis that we've got questions that I think would enable a further conversation. I do see that Karen and Adam have their hands up as well. So should we go to Peter and get him to respond to what you've said so far? I don't want to stop you. It's an interesting question.
Can John have 30 seconds to wrap up that?
Go ahead. Yeah, I'm just saying he's ahead of his time.
I wanted to know about the sense of, you talked about the Eddie Rose and the limiting language, and I thought you were contrasting Monet and Ponge with that, or not. I don't know.
The limiting language I was talking about was this whole Platonist thing of kind of ideas, as it were. I mean, I found that kind of a bit clunky in terms of what I thought the images were doing. He wants to talk about reality, poetic reality, as something just dynamic, constantly changing.
You know, I mean, there's a thinker there's a philosopher in South Africa I was talking to quite recently, and he was saying something. I didn't bring anything about the Platonism, but I was talking about Coleridge's uses of symbolism of light and translucency and opacity, which is very relevant to what you're talking about with Monet. And he was saying, he didn't use the phrase limiting language, but he could have. And he said, but isn't there something mechanical about this sense of light and illumination? And so it's, I think it's a difficult topic too, but it's something we could come back to, I think, John.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry.
It's a language he inherits.
Yes.
Not his language.
Yes, I will think about that. Okay, who's up next? Susan.
I think Karen was next. Over to you, Karen. Thanks, John. That was a really good question. And I do think something we can take further, be in touch about that. So, Karen, yeah.
Okay, just a thought on the back of what John was saying. You were mentioning the Impressionists, illumination, light plays, magic lantern was the technology at the time, the medium at the time to precisely produce this. So I think that, that would be very close. But this is not my question. I'm not even sure it is a proper question. But I was wondering, when you mentioned the substance of nature as something living, and you also emphasized the philosophy of life, and I can see that with insects, and I can see insects around water and animals, but I wondered about those craggy hills that you mentioned. With craggy hills, whether they are something living, whether there is a kind of biology there in what you were saying. And I guess I wondered more about the geology of it. And I wondered whether that geology, how that comes out in Coleridge.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't know about romanticism and geology, but it seems to me a philosophy of life, and a substance of nature as something living is more aligned with biology and vitalism rather than with geology as forces that work.
There's a few things. A few things going on there. One is, so Coleridge has written several essays and an essay and fragments on life, one of which was called The Theory of Life, and he's distinguishing crystals which grow but from ab extra versus things like insects and amoeba and polyps which grow ab intra, from the inside. And he's making these quite nice and nobody really wants to argue with distinctions there. So in some of these texts, he's really quite specific about biological life, and he's not really wanting to say that things like rocks and meteors, etc., are biological or anything like that. But I think it's more a sense of his instead of being a materialist, he's an energist, and everything is at bottom energy, and this is the one life within us and abroad. And something I've been thinking recently is possibly, some philosophers for the last 10, 20 years have been getting excited about the idea of panpsychism. And we can't really explain how consciousness arises. So some philosophers are thinking maybe everything already is in some very minimal, very basic way, kind of conscious. Maybe qualia, these qualitative experiences, already are in some sense qualitative. Schopenhauer's idea of all of existence is some kind of scream, or you could have something jollier from other thinkers. That would I don't adhere to that myself, but that would fit at least with a notion of the nature as living, but I read it myself as nature, as his philosophy is essentially an energism. Everything is pretty much at bottom energy, and that goes towards, in a sense, telically or teleologically, towards life and all those other forms which make life possible in the biological sense. But there's something living about energy. There's something living about, for the very fact that anything to materialize, whether it's a rock or whatnot, it has to go through the sort of birth pains of great opposition before it finds any kind of temporary synthesis and starts to evolve. That's about as far as I can go there for now, I think.
Yeah, I guess.
And the other side of using that is also, it's a kind of rhetorical thing. I don't know whether I should feel guilty about that or not, in that a lot of the new materialists and so on are actually thinking that they're championing, life and squelchiness and goopiness, solidity and crunchiness and all of that, which they think the idealists don't have any of. So there's that side of it in my paper there, which was touched on now and again.
Yeah, I guess I've been wondering about emphasis on organicism, and I have at the back of my mind somebody like Manuel de Landa talking about organic chauvinism, and so I kind of I wonder whether biology that's really a critique of biology. And I just
Yeah.
wonder how much geology comes out of this.
Yeah, there wouldn't have been a problem of organic chauvinism in critiquing Coleridge, because there are letters when he's talking about climbing up a mountain and he's leaving behind goats, and he's getting to an area where he's leaving behind even the birds. And it is here, he writes, this is about 1801 or 1799 or something like that, and it's here that I really most strongly feel the surrounding of life. And part of that psychological. In the absence of life, one feels even more what is most connected to. But there seems to be something metaphysical that he's getting at there, and I have sometimes tried to get at that, but the quick answer evades me right now. But he has said, as I'm leaving, he doesn't use the biological, but as I'm leaving the forms of organic life, I think he uses a phrase pretty much like that, leaving behind the goats and the sheep and even when I'm going past where you can't even see birds anymore, it is here that the sense of life is strongest. And and then he says, he starts to talk about life and death and our normal ways of talking about these things in terms of the material, non-biological natural world are not broad enough right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Peter, for that response. Adam, you have your hand raised.
Yeah. Hi, Peter, and thanks for your talk. I'll try to be quick because I know we're over the time. I was thinking about when you're talking about creative contemplation, which I sort of took to mean, thinking from a place of our physical embeddedness, either toward or perhaps partially influenced by, the ideas which I know from your work we can never fully realize, but they could sort of influence styles of thinking, maybe, or tones of thinking. I was wondering how this idea lines up with Charles Taylor's thesis, one of his theses from A Secular Age, where he talks about how the pre-moderns and the medieval peoples were sort of porous and could feel the influence of things like spirits and things like that are outside of them. Then he goes on to say that in the modern age, because of many cultural reasons that he unfolds over his 900-page book, we've become buffered and can sort of no longer even sort of think about the idea of an outside influence, right? Something that either ideally or otherwise sort of has an influence. And I know there's probably some fine tuning to be done to this idea. So my question is sort of like, do you see, is maybe he's wrong with qualifications, or maybe the thesis would be that there needs to be some kind of cultural work done to create a place where creative contemplation is either possible or more possible. And do you see that as something that sort of needs to be done in our world?
It's really, I find it difficult to think about, to think about and with these authors when they bring in, when they sort of hearken or yearn for time before disenchantment, because the very idea of enchantment, it's very interesting. It's hard. It is partly, one might just quickly say, being enamored with fabrications. I mean, is that what creative contemplation sometimes is? And we, not just as thinkers or academics, but beyond that, just as beings with a responsibility for truth and living properly or well. We don't want to be living in pure, sheer fabrications based on nothing. I was thinking this kind of thing the other day in Japan when I was taking part with my family in a big drum festival, and I really got the strong impression that this festival's been going on for thousands of years. People have got their iPhones and which are using satellites, etc. But still, they're also thoroughly enchanted by this festival, as I was taken up by it sometimes too. And I felt that they were enchanting the avenues of this modern city. And that's what they have to do every year, in a way. COVID was a blow on not just the morale, but also in a deeper sense on the morale, because of a temporary disenchantment was happening there. Sorry, that's more sort of a reaction to what you were saying than a proper answer. Yeah, I mean, the kind of when Coleridge was talking there, in the paper about creative contemplation, he was meaning something, I mean, very important, but small compared to the fabrication of universes or building castles in the air, and then living in them, the harder thing to do. He was talking about just how geometers can bring into existence points, which in a sense exist in the mind of the geometer, and lines and planes and solids. And that's for him creative contemplation. For Plotinus, who he referred to in that, contemplation was something much more, in a sense, awesome. He believed that all of nature, and so Karen, you know, that for Plotinus, nature is living. I mean, bricks and stones and rocks and rubble, because nature finds its form. Everything is evolving, but it, in a sense, finds its form and temporary stability when it reverts back to its source, which is the one, the Platonic or the Plotinian one. When it contemplates the one, things find their form, and in that sense bring their current state into being, and that's creative contemplation. It's the energy emanating from the one which gives this world and all of its bits its forms. I mean, that's pretty wild and weird, and I wouldn't say that I necessarily agree with that, but I do in a sense love it, whether it's right or wrong. It's a lovely creative piece of philosophy and thoughtful thing. And then what you're talking about, that Taylor's talking about in the medieval times, for example, that's something in the middle, isn't it? Something in the middle between the relatively, in terms of these extremes, the relatively trivial seeming, you know, creative contemplation of a dot and a line and a solid, a triangle, and the entire universe for Plotinus, you know, and then there's habitable worlds, tenable worlds. So yeah, I have to say that I can't say much more than I find it difficult to completely embrace enchantment, although I feel it and you know, and think disenchantment is sad, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think I forgot to use the words enchantment and disenchantment, which would have maybe made this an easier question to ask. But yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, I mean, Coleridge, I wonder, you know, this is just a biographical question I have, like, what was his, you know, his level of disenchantment? In 1796, right, he says something like, the smoke and fog of our towns and cities obscures the face of God, which sounds a little bit eco-critical, you know. But at the same time, too, I think that he, you know, he would go on a ship and he would look at the sails, and he would go in London, he would look at the buildings, and he would feel the enchantment from those things too. So I think it creates an interesting challenge where, and
yes, like a rolling
right?
enchantment. You don't have to be harking back to the medieval times and so on. You can have a rolling enchantment of iPhones, for example, and so on.
If you're enchanted with something that's damaging the world too, I mean, that can be problematic, right? So I think these are questions that are still on the horizon, but yeah, that's basically why I wanted to ask. So thank you.
Thanks. Yes, very thoughtful.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Peter. We've got to 2:12. I don't know if you want to carry on talking, or whether we should wrap this up, Peter, but I just got.
If no one's asking, I'm stopping.
Sorry?
If no one's asking, I can, you know.
Okay, I have just a quick follow-up from what Adam was just saying, and this is so does this mean that disenchantment basically equates with death, because enchantment is vibrancy in ideas and matter? Does that mean that to be disenchanted is, you know, entropic in a way? It equates with death or not?
Yeah, I mean, I can see filling that out, getting to the meaning in that via Coleridge, in the sense that, you know, I gave you the quotation of what he thought about Descartes' system, which saw the whole universe as grinding dust, the dust by which it whirls itself around, and he talks about that and related materialisms and mechanisms as a philosophy of death, as a Gorgon's head which turns everything to stone that it looks at. That's what materialism is. It's a Gorgon's head that turns everything. And so that is actually saying, I think, what you're saying there. When you can only see the physical place and dimensions and quantities of things, it is disenchanted. It might as well be dead for what you're getting from it. You know, but Coleridge also believed that one is, some sense, not just consciously contemplating ideas. There's a kind of, this is something I write about in that book from 2020. There's a kind of, and it's the phrase I use, there's an inchoate contemplation which reaches us not through the understanding and philosophical theories and so on, but through aesthetics, through the ethos in which we're living. So, for example, think of a festival in 2023 that is a 1,000-year-old festival or a 200-year-old festival or something, or the maypoles in England and so on. There's a kind of enchantment, even if you're not even thinking about the meaning of it. I mean, not many people are really thinking anthropologically, even 400 years ago, or sociologically, or whatnot, about these festivals, etc., these processes of enchantment. But of course, it can occur in all kinds of moments when the nihilistic, materialistic, or whatever philosopher is, you know, sitting on a bench and looking at the sea. There can be moments of enchantment which are aesthetic, despite herself or despite himself. That is to say, despite some kind of nihilism or abject materialism. I'm not saying that materialism is abject. I'm saying there are kinds of materialism which are abject. If you're a materialist, it doesn't mean you're abject or utterly nihilistic, by the way. But I'm just saying there are kinds which are. Yeah.
So, I mean, I've often thought about those lines from the Aeolian harp, and I know you took this out of the paper that you gave today, the stilly murmur of the distant sea that tells us of silence, that it's right at the edge of the imagination. It's as far away as he can hear, that the senses bring things to his mind. But it's still there. It is still a distant, a stilly murmur, but it's edging on stillness. It's edging on silence. And it seems to me that if we go from there to Frost at Midnight, silence and stillness are very problematic for an inertia, I suppose, very problematic for Coleridge. And they sit on the edge of, almost on the edge of annihilation. Would that be true to say or not, do you think?
I think partly. Coleridge has spoken against what he called the despotism of the eye, for being so immediate, for removing all distances, in comparison to pretty much what you're saying about hearing. And we have to stretch to hear. That in itself is an image of contemplation of what he calls powers or ideas. It's the sense of distance is more with us. The sense of remove is more with us with something like hearing. But that telling us of silence, I don't read that in a Hamlet kind of way, you know, the end. Although maybe I should, because it's, you know, Coleridge who called himself Hamlet sometimes. I see it as a meditative piece, as something joyful yet calm. But no, it
is a beautiful image, isn't it? I mean, the image is one of beauty. But that gradual sliding of everything into silence before you come to the surge of the plastic imagination and the harp is the image of the sea being so distant and so quiet immediately gives way to that surge of energy immediately afterwards. So which would equate with the fountain. Yeah.
One thing that kept that sort of alive and not dead, that silence, isn't there at the same time the smell of the, what is it, the sweet peas or something, or the beans from the bean field?
The bean field.
So that smell, of course, is well, any animal's reptile brain is awakened with smell, isn't, you know? So that might be something that's sort of irritating me back to life with that. And
okay, well, I might be sort of going down a rabbit hole with that one, but we probably should conclude here because we're almost at 2:20. But for those of us who are present, I'd just like to, I don't think anybody has anything else they would like to ask. I can't see any hands raised. I'd just like to thank you for your talk today, which has, you know, it's been great. We've really got so much that we're going to go away with and talk about. Are we going to get back, as you know?
Because I couldn't read all of it, but yeah.
No, well, I mean, there's a limit to what you can actually present, obviously, in a paper, even of 40 minutes or an hour. But I very much hope, Peter, that you will come back to join us when you're over here next year, and we could pick up some of these ideas and
I will.
What you've been doing in the meantime. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much for coming along. Thanks, Peter, for joining us. Really appreciate that, and we'll be in touch and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure what I need to do in order to keep this recording. I've never done it before.
No, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to stop recording.
Does anybody know what to do?
Yeah, it'll just record onto your. You'll get a notice from Zoom. I would imagine. Yeah, or Susan will get a notice from Zoom.
Okay.
I think you may get one as well, Karen, if this is my experience from previous meetings. They will tell you that they would give you a link to the recording. At least I hope so. That should be the case.
Well, can I just,
so
it will ask you whether you want to record it on your computer or on the cloud. If it does ask you that, I suggest clicking record on my computer. Then once you close, there will be a brief time where it is sort of like compressing the data into a file.
Right.
I would say keep your computer on during that time. And then after that, it'll be somewhere on your computer.
All right. And all that dialogue comes later, not now, or it's not something I've missed.
Thanks.
Yeah,
great.
after you stop the recording.
Okay.
Karen, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, there's something in the chat, but it will come.
I'm not seeing anything.
Something in the chat, so that will also come as part of the recording.
I'll read that. Yes, the messages.
That's
yes.
great. Marvelous. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone, and good to see some of you again, and good to see a few of you for the first time, and looking forward to seeing you next year.
Yeah. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay, Karen, thank you very much. I thought that went really well.
So too.
I had to interrupt him. I'm so sorry. I did put a message to him in the chat saying sorry to interrupt you, but I felt that given we got a limited amount of time, and you've been waiting for quite some while by then, as had Adam, that I really wanted to move on. But,
well, Susan, I didn't really have much to say, but I just, I thought, as part organizer, I felt kind of compelled I should say something. I hope it wasn't very clear how I put it, but
I'd like to sort of take him further on some of those questions about matter and its meaning, actually contemporaneously with Coleridge and some of the other people who are writing, even people like you mentioned geology, like James Hutton, who
yes, I was thinking I was thinking of James Hutton. I was thinking of the German Romantics. I was thinking of the Rune Mountain by Tieck. I was thinking of Novalis, and their geology is really much more prevalent than biology. Rocks are more important than plants or insects or I think so. So I guess, but I didn't put it very well.
Put it well. And I mean, the thing about Hutton and his geology is that rocks are the stuff of life. They grind down, they produce the soil that is what gives life to everything. But they're caught up in that cycle of renewal and catastrophic violence and material experience that then starts the whole thing going over again. It's a bit like, a cataclysmic version of the eddy rose that Coleridge writes about.
Yeah, but it's not biology. It's geology and chemistry, and that's so it's not living. It's non-organic, it's non-living, and yet it creates and transforms. I guess that's more what I was trying to get at.
It makes life possible. I loved your bit about the phantasmagoria too. Really good. So I should probably let you go, and I've got to get on to something else in less than an hour. So, but I thought that was really good, and it worked much. I was anxious about how it would work because I hadn't done one of these online, although I've been a speaker in several of these sorts of things. I've never been somebody who's actually had to be responsible for it. But I thought
it worked. So thank you so much for sharing this. And you'll be chairing the next one too. Not the next one, the one after
One
that.
after, which will be Devon. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I'm sorry I mispronounced Peter Cheney's name.
Don't worry, it doesn't matter. Not a problem. People have names that don't necessarily sound like what they look like.
Yeah.
Cheney. So I've always heard him called Peter Cheney, but I move in the circles in which he works, so I hear his name mentioned. I had that advantage. Okay, lovely to see you, Karen. Take care.
Bye-bye, Susan.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
bye. Bye.